Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diogo Machado, and I'm the president of the Studies Nucleus of Political Science and International Relations of the new University of Lisbon. I would like to welcome you all to this masterclass on world order and rising powers given by Professor Amitav Acharya. This was meant to be on last Friday, but due to unexpected circumstances, we had to reschedule it for today. But we are very happy to have you here. And I'm sure this will be an outstanding event. So this is the last event of the semester of the Nucleus, and I cannot think of a better way to finish it. To those who have participated in our activities so far, I want to thank you, as well as to those who are joining us today. For all of you who wish to keep track of our activities and participate in the next ones, I would recommend that you follow us on our social media and join us anytime. Today, we are delighted to be joined by a very special guest, Professor Amitav Acharya. Professor Amitav Acharya is UNESCO's chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance and a professor at American University, Washington, D.C. Professor Amitav Acharya was also the first non-Western scholar to be elected as the president of International Studies Association between 2014 and 2015. He's one of the most prominent scholars of contemporary international relations, having published often in leading international affairs journals, such as International Organization, International Security, and many more. He has also published pivotal books such as The End of American World Order, Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia, Non-Western International Relations, among others. His works are very influential and frequently cited, having contributed to major developments on the field, especially regarding non-Western international relations, Asian regionalism, world order, international relations theory. I want to thank deeply Professor Amitav Acharya for accepting our invitation in such a kind manner. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you today, Professor. And before I hand it over to Professor Amitav Acharya to start the masterclass, I would just like to speak to you a little bit about the structure. So the masterclass will occur as follows. Until roughly 7 p.m. Lisbon time, 2 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, Professor will speak about the topic world order and rising powers. Then Professor will be answering your questions for half an hour. For that, I would ask you to please send your questions via chat to me. The chat is disabled, so you can only send the questions to me during the masterclass at any time. And in the limited time we have, I will try to put the most I can to the professor. So without further delay, I hope everything is clear. I will now hand over to Professor Amitav Acharya so he can start our masterclass. Thank you so much, Professor. Again, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you all for being here. Enjoy the masterclass.
Thank you very much. And Diego, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I apologize for the fact that I could not be with you on Friday, last minute development that I had to postpone or cancel my appearance. But I hope you forgive me. But today we will, I hope we have a very productive time. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is world order. And I will focus particularly on the role of rising powers. Now, I'm going to focus a fair bit on what has happened in the past year for the obvious reason that we have had a lot of very important developments, two of which really stand out. One is the COVID-19, although it started in December last year, but really the impact, the global spread of the pandemic only happened earlier this year, February, March onwards. And we have been living through this horrible times. But towards the end of the year, we had a second development, which I think has a lot of significance for world order, which is the American presidential elections and the victory of Joe Biden over Donald Trump, although President Trump is yet to concede his defeat. But that is a momentous development as well, because the United States still remains a very critical player in shaping and managing world order. So based on these two developments, and also drawing on my previous work on world order, I would give you my view on what has happened, what are the implications of that for both world order in general and emerging powers in particular, and what can we expect for the future, even though I don't make any predictions, but I will anticipate some trends. Now, some of you might have read my earlier books on this topic. I just have two particular books in mind. One is called The End of American World Order. This is the second edition of a book that I first wrote in 2014. And then the more recent one, which was published in 2018, is Constructing Global Order. Now, some of the conceptual framing of what I am going to talk today will derive from those books, but it will also update my findings and my arguments in those two books. And also, as things change, that we live in a very fluid, dynamic time, I will try to draw the implications and add in the implications of the most recent developments, including the pandemic and the US presidential election outcome. So my main argument is very simple. The main argument is that even though the changes or the developments of the last year have been quite significant, and especially the global pandemic, but they are not going to fundamentally change the trajectory of where or how the world order was evolving. They are accelerating rather than disrupting or changing the trends that we had already seen in motion for at least more than a decade and a half, even longer. So COVID-19 and the US presidential elections make a difference, but they don't change the trajectory of changes or direction or trajectory of the world order shift that we were already experiencing. So that's my main argument. And I would like to flesh it out in terms of four areas. I'll look at how the recent developments have affected the global power shift. And second, how they have affected globalization, which is a key element of world order. Third, impact on global governance and multilateralism, which again is a very important foundation of or element of world order. And finally, some general points about where we are heading from the past through the present to the future. And here I will draw on some of the concepts I have developed for the last half a decade or so, which is the idea of a pluralistic, decentralized, or what I call a multiplex world. And I'm going to call it a multiplex G+ world. So the argument again is that we are going to see acceleration. We are already seeing acceleration of trends that are already been evident before the pandemic, even before Trump. And those changes are going to lead to a more decentered, pluralistic, multiplex G+ world. So let me start by looking at the global power shift. Now, again, this was ongoing for some time, especially in economic terms, but also in political and strategic terms. So we know this very well, that the relative economic importance of the West, including the United States, was declining relative to those of, say, China and other emerging powers. So even before the COVID pandemic, between China and India, they were already close to 20% of the world's GDP. So that was before Trump, when I was writing about in 2014, 2015, when I first wrote my book, first published my book, End of American World Order. But what has COVID done is to accelerate that trend. So if you look at the data today, Of course, the global economy is going to shrink. According to IMF estimates that the overall world economy might contract in 2020 by minus 4.4%. It could be different. I mean, I am really very careful about accepting any estimates from anyone, including IMF, because there are so many unknown factors or unknown variables here whose impact we do not know very well. But still, there is no question that this is a significant recession in the world, significant shrinkage in the global economy. But even within that, there are variations. Some countries, some regions are doing better than others. So if you look at the IMF estimate until recently, October 2020, while the global economy is supposed to shrink by 4.4% in 2020, Asia's economy, economies of Asian countries, is supposed to only shrink by half of that, minus 2.2%. So Asia is doing a little better. Well, the same IMF report predicted that the global economy will actually rebound and may experience a growth of close to 5.2% in 2021. But for Asia, that will be higher. Asia's economy may increase or grow by 6.9%, close to 7%. So you see the relative difference between global growth projections and Asia's growth projections, and Asia comes out better. Again, why is that important? Because it's not something totally unexpected, by the way. Asia was the fastest growing region in the world before, but one reason why Asia is coming out better in this COVID situation, crisis, is because Asia has managed to do a better job of containing the pandemic. Not all Asian countries, but East Asian countries in particular have done a better job compared to Europe and certainly compared to the United States. So if you look at who has done the best job in containing the pandemic, it will be China. Of course, as we all know, the virus started in China and had a severe impact in the beginning, but China turned it around. But Korea has done well. Taiwan has done well. Southeast Asian countries, with the exception of maybe Indonesia or Philippines, have done reasonably well. And also, if you look at the neighboring countries, particularly, or the neighboring region, South Pacific, Australia and New Zealand have done well. So if you look at whether Asia or Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, that region comes out better in terms of economic performance. It was already an economic powerhouse, but has done better in handling the pandemic. And there is a clear correlation here between the ability to contain the pandemic and economic performance. Whereas some countries, especially the United States, rushed to reopen the economy without containing the pandemic. The Asian countries that I mentioned did it the other way around. They contained the pandemic first before they opened up all sectors of the economy. So putting health before economic growth or economic performance has actually served well for East Asia. And that's a general lesson, by the way, for the rest of the world. You cannot really open up your economy and expect growth to continue when people are dying. So that's the general point. But there are variations, as I said. Not every country, even within Asia, have done equally well. And certainly not all the emerging powers, the rising powers, have done equally well. India hasn't done very well. In Asia, it stands out as having one of the worst performances economically in dealing with this pandemic. So I think we need to be careful about those variations. And that leads me to the emerging powers, the rising powers. What have they done? How have they performed? Well, here, the performance is very much a mixed situation. So you have all heard about the BRICS. So when we talk about rising powers, we often think in terms of BRICS, although the category rising power is broader than BRICS. But the 5 countries in BRICS group kind of symbolize, epitomize the rise of non-Western countries. So that will be China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. If you look at their performance and also the impact of COVID-19 on these 5 countries, it's very uneven. Again, China, as I mentioned, has done very well. In fact, the IMF projection is that China will be the only country in this group that will actually grow this year, 2020. The growth rate would be 1.9% according to IMF projections. The rest of the BRICS will contract, and some more significantly than others. So India is projected to contract, have an economic contraction by 10.3%. Again, these statistics is not cast in stone, but IMF is a credible source, so I want to mention that. Brazil is the next worst performer in some way. Well, maybe South Africa is the next worst performer, minus 8% contraction for 2020, followed by Brazil, minus 5.8%, and then followed by Russia, which is minus 4.2%. So there is a spectrum of economic impact or implications of COVID-19. What this is going to do is that it is going to widen the gap between China and the rest of the BRICS, which is not surprising, by the way. Again, none of this is really surprising or unprecedented, because since the 2000s, so since the 2010, when this idea of BRICS started gaining traction, China has always outperformed the rest of the BRICS. China was always ahead of the pack. China accounted for a large part of the growth of the overall growth of the BRICS. But the others were doing well. India was doing fairly well. But now we would see that China will move ahead a little, maybe not a little, more than a little, from the rest of the BRICS. And that creates an intra-BRIC disparity, a disparity among or within the rising power bloc. And this could have implications because there's always some tensions between China and other BRICS nations, particularly India. And this economic disparity, growing economic imbalance could actually undermine the cohesion of the BRICS. Now, strategic impact comes with that. So as if the BRICS, as if the economic crisis caused by the pandemic was not enough, China and India got into a border conflict earlier this year. And this was, some analysts say this had nothing to do with the pandemic itself, but others say there was a link because this is a general sort of pattern to Chinese strategic behavior after the pandemic broke out. So China was widely criticized, including by a lot of Chinese. The Chinese government was criticized by the Chinese people for its lack of transparency and lack of its denial of the true implications of COVID-19 when it first broke out in Wuhan, especially the initial denial of the human-to-human transmission. This was criticized within China as much as outside. But later on, of course, the Chinese government managed to crack down and suppress the internal criticism and try to put up a kind of brave face to the outside world and try to also make up for its initial mishandling, although it never admitted it was a mishandling, but try to make up by providing masks and now vaccines. So we call it masks and vaccine diplomacy. So in that sense, China is not totally kind of a winner out of this crisis. It's a soft power, its image has suffered, in fact, more so than any other BRICS. So if China has gained more in economic terms, or is coming out of this better than other BRICS in economic terms, in terms of soft power, it might have lost more because China had a pretty good pool of soft power beforehand. And I don't think the mask and vaccine diplomacy is going to totally undo that damage. At the same time, the rest of the BRICS, and also I was talking a little bit about how this might have affected Chinese strategic behavior. This year has seen many examples of Chinese assertiveness, not just on the India-China border, where India and China got into a border conflict, and people on both sides died, soldiers died in both sides. The Chinese have not revealed how many people they lost, how many soldiers they lost. Indians lost over around 20 people. But this is the first major direct conflict between China and India for a long time. And these are two most important BRICS, although you can say Russia is very important, but among the sort of rising powers, Russia is already an established power. China and India are really the two most critical players in the BRICS. And if they get into a direct military confrontation, for whatever reason, it undermines the credibility of the BRICS and of this whole idea of rising powers. And this could have been linked to the fact that this is not the only thing that China has, where China has shown a military assertiveness. This has been in South China Sea against Vietnam, against Philippines, in East China Sea, vis-a-vis Japan, and also on the Taiwan Straits. China's military assertiveness has increased, including military incidents between Chinese and these nations. So this is again both intra-BRIC development, especially India and China, and also a regional development. It undermines Asian stability, and also a danger signal warning for global stability. What about the rest of the BRICS? I mean, again, many of these developments in the BRICS nations are domestic. In Brazil, there has been rising protests and also populism, the conflict between populism and protest, official populism of the government and protest, disaffection of the people has grown, as in South Africa. And this leads to the question whether the BRICS are going to be stable domestically. It's not just a question of international, what international role they can play, but whether they will be domestically stable politically, and whether they will maintain their economic position, which was emerging as quite significant, in a significant way, as a share of the global economy, whether they can maintain that into the future. And if the BRICS cannot keep their own house in order, and if they have to focus so much on domestic developments, particularly reviving their economies, how can they be expected to play a role in shaping world order and global governance? Because there have been a lot of talk about the rise of the West, and rise of the BRICS is a big part of the rise of the West, and how the BRICS have demanded a greater share of leadership in global governance, reform of multilateral institutions. They have created their own institutions, like the BRICS New Development Bank and the Contingent Reserve Fund. All these things have been happening for the last decade or so, and now there are big question marks about the future of the BRICS. So I want to move on from there and try to link with trends in globalization, trends in global governance, and finally world order. So globalization has been severely affected by the events of last year, but it's not what the media or the public intellectuals generally present it to be. Again, globalization was already facing a backlash, but mainly in the developed countries. So there was a time when the developing countries, so the third world, what we call the third world, or used to call the third world, now we call global south, they were suspicious of globalization. If you look at the literature on international political economy at students of international relations, you should have looked at that. In the 1970s, there was a backlash against globalization at that stage. So there were demands for more equitable growth, a new international economic order. So the biggest critiques of globalization were actually the developing countries. They felt that current neoliberal globalization is leaving the global south behind. It is creating more inequality between the north and the south. There was a heavy criticism of multinational corporations, foreign investment, and the like. But in the 21st century, as we moved away from the 1970s, 80s, 90s to the 21st century, 90s and 21st century, the opinion towards globalization in some, at least the some, if not all the global south countries changed. So it was kind of an ironic twist that the global south countries, especially the big economies in the global south, became bigger champions of globalization, whereas the people, if not the leaders, of the global north became critiques of globalization. So support for globalization increased in the global south and contracted in the global north. And the best example of the latter, contraction of global support for globalization or the backlash against globalization, is Donald Trump. Trump got elected mainly in 2016, mainly by exploiting sentiments, popular sentiments against globalization in certain parts of the United States, the Midwest and a little bit in the global south, which have been left behind, which have actually lost economic well-being from globalization, especially job losses coming from transfer of industries, migration of industries from those areas of the United States to other places, the global south, like China, India, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and others. So there was a popular sentiments against the benefits of globalization that cuts across Democrats and Republicans, by the way, which is why Trump was able to win the presidency in 2016 by winning those critical states like Michigan, or swing states like Michigan and Wisconsin. So another example of the backlash against globalization is in Europe. Brexit was partly due to this, not only due to that, but partly there was a backlash against globalization, this time led by the European Union. So, and there are populist movements where they were more ideological than economic, but the ideological, pushback against globalization went hand in hand against the perceived economic inequities caused by globalization. So again, this is nothing new, but after COVID-19, this increasing kind of a emerging backlash against globalization became much more severe. And that was because of the very clear evidence that the cause of the global spread of the pandemic, not the spread of the pandemic, the outbreak of the pandemic, but the spread of the pandemic globally was because of globalization, and particularly because of travel and tourism. When the dust settles on COVID-19, there will be more research. But my own preliminary assessment is that a lot of this happened because of tourism and travel. I mean, there's no other way this could have spread so fast, so far, so quickly, I mean, at such scale. Of course, tourism and travel tourism, tourism is linked to very much globalization. Travel is linked to tourism, but travel is also due to economic reasons. You know, a lot of economic conferences, for example, some of the earliest examples of transmission happened at business meetings. There was one example where in Singapore, an international business conference had a Chinese participant from, I guess, Wuhan, and then a European participant, and that particular meeting might have been responsible for transmitting the virus from China to Europe via Singapore. There is much more direct evidence of tourists from China going to Europe. In one case, even an infected tourist who admitted to that, causing the initial spread of the virus. But of course, the virus itself is also responsible. This is a virus that spreads much more easily. It's much more infectious than, say, the previous big pandemic involving this coronavirus, the SARS of 2003. But certainly travel and tourism and travel linked to both pleasure and business links that are intrinsic to globalization did play a role. So that creates a backlash against globalization. Another way in which COVID-19 damaged the sort of credibility of globalization as something that is good for the world is the closing of the borders. The rapidity with which countries close down their frontiers, borders, including the European Union, which is supposed to be a borderless world, a borderless union. But even in Southeast Asia, borders were closed and still remain closed to everything except the most essential diplomatic or humanitarian regions. But even humanitarian regions are not enough to reopen travel and tourism, or even just simple travel. And borders have been closed even within countries, like Australia. Some states have refused to let other states or people from other states, including residents of that state, to come back to their own state. This is totally unprecedented and was never expected. In 2003 SARS crisis, borders were not closed, but that virus was less infectious, more deadly, but less infectious. But still, the kind of instinctive way in which borders got closed undermines the credibility of globalization as something that is permanent, durable, irreversible. Nobody had expected it, at least not to this extent. Now, globalization is supposed to be a borderless thing. So we have been talking about how globalization undermines the nation state, but it didn't. It in fact accentuated the importance of the nation state. So look in relation to that, the fact that another facet of globalization is economic interdependence and also what we call supply chains. The idea of producing one thing, whether it's the iPhone or the 787 Dreamliner or a car, across several national jurisdictions. So a lot of the products in the world today, especially higher technology products, are produced across national frontiers, involving several national jurisdictions. So it's a component manufacturing of components, of different components of the same product, and assembling it in one place and exporting it globally. Now that has been also heavily criticized as not being a good thing by some leaders, actually many leaders, including of course Trump, because when the COVID-19 started spreading, countries found that they don't produce enough medical equipment, protective gear, masks on their own territory. They have to import it because globalization has made them dependent on these imports. And this is when President Trump said very clearly that the idea of global supply chain is a crazy thing. He used the term crazy. So he said we should be more self-reliant. And he was already asking American companies to come back home from places like China. But this added to a populist sort of, give him a populist support base or argument to make his case. Now, even in other countries, the goal of being more self-reliant economically became more acceptable in a way that was not possible before. I'm not saying that countries are going to completely retract from globalization and become totally self-reliant. It's not possible. But there is this ideological and economic and public health argument now to disrupt supply chains or to become more nationally self-reliant. Trump was already attacking supply chains anyway, especially he was trying to move supply chains away from China to other countries. But this gives people, populist leaders like him, an additional weapon. And that undermines globalization because the foundation of globalization is supply chains, the borderless world. The borderless world, supply chains, and blaming tourism and travel, which are really the foundations of globalization, have all been challenged severely. This may not lead to the end of globalization, but this will create some new ways of rethinking globalization. And certainly it not be, this will be a much more critical approach to selective approach to globalization that we have seen. And we can see that. I mean, there would be, of course, other development that would build into this. There could be new types of globalization. Globalization that is led by, say, China and not by the West. That could happen. Globalization will be more through regionalization than regionalism, and regionalization will not be considered as opposed to globalization, but as a complement to globalization. It was already a bit of the case, a little bit of the case, but now people would focus more on regionalization, because you have to live with your neighbors. You cannot push them away, but you can certainly try to contract your global supply chain closer to home. And regional organizations or regionalization is maybe, I'm not saying this will happen, but in some kind of places like European Union, we have seen that happening. In East Asia, we just had seen the East Asian countries, ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, signing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So that's the only, in fact, I don't know the only, but certainly the most important regional trade agreement that have been signed in recent years. Certainly in 2020, I cannot think of another regional trade agreement. So that's, and this RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is not inimical to globalization. It's a regional approach to globalization. It's creating a larger internal market so that everybody can trade with each other better, but also with the rest of the world. Now that could be another direction in globalization, more emphasis on regional avenues rather than relying on the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which was already suffering anyway. Moving on now to global governance, which is the third point I want to make in assessing the impact of COVID-19 and the related developments in world order. Global governance, again, was already weakening, not weakening in the absolute sense, it was taking a different form. It was becoming more pluralized. So, which is to say that the post-World War II architecture of globalization was, some people call it fragmenting. I have also used the term fragmenting, but I think we can say pluralizing, meaning it was broadening and bringing in new types of actors, new types of processes, new types of modalities. So instead of the big multilaterals, like the UN system, with WTO, IMF, World Bank, WHO, instead of these being the dominant or the only, at one point, they would be the only real players in the global governance architecture. They were being joined, if not challenged, by other types of institutions and partnerships and networks. So we have seen that in regional trade arrangements. A lot of regional trade arrangements are coming up, which was now joining the WTO. We have seen also the developments like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was sponsored initiated by China, but included many countries, including India. We have seen initiatives from the BRICS, the new development bank. But outside of trade, this was happening in climate change. A lot of local initiatives at the level of the cities or states, and partnership between private foundations, city governments, national governments, NGOs. We have seen the emergence of networks, private foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on global health. So you'll find plenty of examples of, some people call it fragmentation. As I said, I also used the term before, but I now prefer to call it pluralization. Pluralization because many of these initiatives do not necessarily challenge, or their goal is not to displace existing multilateral institutions, but to complement it or to find alternatives where the big multilaterals have neither the resources nor the mandate and are too politicized to play a role. So this was nothing new, but I think last year's developments will make it push that trend even further. So you have already seen the WHO, the World Health Organization, the United States pulled out of it under Trump. Biden is going to go back to it. But the WHO also, there are questions about WHO's role, which are legitimate, and it should really answer through its an open, impartial investigation, which is supposed to carry out. Why was the WHO not faster, more proactive? I mean, it's cannot fault it entirely because there have been reports that they didn't get access to the site of the outbreak of the pandemic in China, Wuhan, soon enough. They had to wait for weeks before being allowed in. The team from WHO was allowed in. So that needs to be, looked at. But also, there are questions about whether they were really prepared to provide the kind of advice that would have been required, because they were, like everybody else, they might have been caught by surprise of the scale and the infectiousness of this virus. But we have also seen that the United Nations, moving from WHO to the UN system in general, it has not been really reassuring. I'm sure the UN has its supporters, if you ask. We have, of course, the UN Secretary General from Portugal, and I think a very capable man, very capable leader, but his hands are tied. There's too much politics going around here. And I think the UN could have done a better job in reassuring the world, if not doing everything possible, but reassuring the world about this global crisis. I don't want to blame the UN directly, but I think I will blame the system and the politicization of the UN. That kind of contracts its effectiveness. And, people will look at IMF, World Bank, and their role. And I think generally, as a long-time observer of multilateralism, I personally feel the multilateral system have not come up to expectations during the past year. And I hope that will change. Moving on to regionalism, we have seen the European Union. European Union, of course, is the most important, most well-endowed regional organization in the world. And initially it faltered, didn't do a pretty good job in the first few months of the pandemic. There were all kinds of blame game, Italy blaming Brussels about lack of support, borders being closed, sorry. But the European Union pulled back, and I think did a credible job, especially when it comes to economic stimulus. I think it is probably fair to say that the European Union has done a better job on the economic front in dealing with the pandemic, on the economic front, than on the medical front. Because, well, again, this virus is very tricky, but you can see that the rates of infection are rising, mortality is rising, and again, that makes you wonder whether the EU could have done a better job of containing this. Other regional organizations also haven't done as well as one might have expected. ASEAN, again, has not done as well as it did in 2003. Much better performance in 2003 SARS crisis. But anyway, I'll move away from this now and say that we don't see global governance redeeming itself during this pandemic. And that's what really make people think what to do next. And I think one of the trends in the future will be, as I was saying, more and more pluralization of global governance, new types of partnerships, initiatives, both at the regional level, but at the plurilateral level, among countries from different regions, joining hands, moving away from, not leaving the big multilateral institutions, but doing things that are through a variety of different institutions, different networks. And you will see more networking rather than formal institution building, intergovernmental cooperation. You will see more public-private partnerships emerging in the world. So again, this is accelerating a trend that was already there before. So now I move to my final point, the remaining 10 minutes or so. And this is about how what all this means for world order. Well, to be very blunt, the events of last year really undermines the credibility and the longevity of the Western-dominated world order, what we call the liberal international order led by the United States. Nothing new again. Again, I have written about this from 2014 onwards. But this is a kind of a blow, another nail in the coffin, so to speak, of the idea of a liberal world order as kind of a hegemonic, overarching global order. Now, I have to be very careful what I say by that. I don't think the liberal order will disappear, but it will remain much less, it will become much less important, much less what I call hegemonic, much less dominant compared to the past, compared to especially since the beginning of the end of the Cold War, so to speak, since the early 1990s. Now, I had always argued that liberal order was not a global order. The idea of a liberal international order as a global order was a myth. The idea of liberal hegemony was a myth. But a lot of Western scholars, particularly American scholars, argued that this was a liberal hegemonic order, or what they call liberal hegemony. This was the dominant world order that might even co-opt challenges or potential challenges like China. Well, I don't think anybody is going to argue that anymore. That somehow this order will revive. I had argued that the liberal order was always like a club of the West. It was a transatlantic club, like going to a club with privileges that are due more to its founding members than to newcomers or to those who are not members of the club. So now what you will see is that liberal order might retreat to that kind of clubbishness, especially with Biden, President Biden in the United States, already talking about working with his allies, including European allies. You might see that liberal order will, turn into, as it was in the founding, a club of the West, of the liberal democracies of the West. And in fact, John Eikenberry, who actually has done more than anybody else to promote this notion of the liberal international order, has argued that in his most recent book, To Make the World Safe for Democracy. And I think that sort of vindicates my argument that this order was always not global. It was a club of the West, and it will not disappear, but it will become what it was in the beginning, one of the international orders. Remember the Cold War. The Cold War had multiple orders, at least two. There was a liberal international order led by the US and featuring the Western European countries. And then there was the socialist world order led by the Soviet Union and including the Eastern European countries. And also a lot of the third world countries, global South countries, were either neutral or more sympathetic to the socialist order, arguably. So this is nothing new, but people had, after the end of the Cold War, the liberal scholars have kind of internalized the belief that this was a global order, this was hegemonic, there's no challenge, and ideologically, there was Fukuyama talking about the end of history, no challenge to capitalism or communism, and then in the question of global ordering, no challenge to the Western-dominated, US-dominated international order or the liberal order. I think that was always problematic, and now nobody's going to even talk about it. At the same time, the liberal international order will remain an international order, one of the orders which will bring in like-minded countries from the West, but I don't think it will bring in other countries, certainly not to the rising powers like China, India, the way that its proponents had argued or expected in about a decade ago. And the United States' credibility has been severely damaged, especially under Trump. It is seen as ineffectual in responding to the virus and insensitive, too transactional, too selfish. And that was partly because of Trump's policies, which was already in motion, but also his responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. The US soft power, which is also an element of the US-led liberal order, was already weakened, but much more severely so after the pandemic. Now, Biden is going to revive it a little bit. I think he is going to definitely be more multilateral and more decent and more inclusive. But he's not going to revive the order and its foundations under American influence. So the big challenge for Biden and the United States is, how do you revive the liberal order without making it hegemonic or without inviting a pushback from those who do not want to be part of it? And how to adapt the US-led international order to the new realities, which were before and after COVID. And that's not going to be easy. The United States will not be, the leader of the world order. The current world order would not be identified as kind of American-led, which it was earlier on. And again, to me, I'm not surprised, because this reflects, the changes in world order reflects changes in the global power and ideas, distribution of power, global distribution of power and ideas over a long term. It didn't happen in one day. Trump was a consequence rather than cause of the changes in world order that had already happened, including pushback against globalization. So Biden is not going to bring back the liberal order. Trump did not undermine the liberal order in the first place, although he pushed it towards the edge. But Biden is not going to revive the liberal order by just being nice to the rest of the world and playing multilaterally. World order changes due to a much wider range of factors and characteristics, and we cannot recreate the past in the future. I think the world will be based on, the future world order will be based on the trends I've already discussed. Global economic shift towards Asia, that will be one trend, and generally a global economic shift away from the West towards the rest, but especially Asia, and to emphasize that. Second, it will be based on a more pluralized system of global governance rather than just based on the UN or big global institutions. Third, it will be based on a less extreme or a neoliberal vision of globalization. The pushback against globalization will continue, but this will not end globalization. There will be more of a complexity in globalization with more regional approaches and more countries, some countries accepting globalization more than others, and also leadership in global economic development and trade coming from countries like China and possibly revived India and others than from the traditional West. When it comes to, I should mention, when the climate change, which is a very important issue, I should have talked about it during the global governance situation. I think the West will remain important and the European Union will remain very important in climate change. And this is where we see a kind of changing pattern of leadership. Leadership in the world of the 21st century is not going to be based on what it was in the last 50 years or the second half of the 20th century. It's not going to be based on simply power, that the most powerful country leads in every area of global governance. First of all, power is going to be dispersed. The United States will remain the leading global military power for the foreseeable future. China will increasingly challenge the US when it comes to economic power and may even overtake it. So power will be divided between the US and China. But when it comes to leadership, there is no correlation between power and leadership. And this is intrinsic to my concept of a multiplex world, a G+ world. And I'll talk about it and end my presentation there. In a multiplex and G+ world, first of all, multiplex is not multipolarity, because multipolarity is based on distribution of power. And traditionally, that has meant distribution of military and economic power. So in a unipolar world, we have one power. In a bipolar world, you have two. In a multipolar, you have more than three. But power is counted a major in terms of military economic power. Now, multiplex world brings in, and also, by the way, those powers are big powers, great powers. A multipolar world is a big power, great power world, just like European multipolarity before World War II. They're all great powers. I don't know, Portugal was considered a great power, although it was the first country to find a sea route to Africa, to India. So power was blatantly based on material power. Now, that's going to change. I always argued in a multiplex, the concept of multiplex world argues, holds, that there's a difference between power and leadership. So the most powerful countries are not necessarily the best leaders. Either in terms of willing or able to provide leadership. So the United States has been very strong power, number one. Still in all the indices of power, United States leads the world in power. But it hasn't been a very good leader. It depends. Leadership depends on who is in power, who has the presidency. Trump was not a leader of any kind in the world. And Bill Clinton probably was, Barack Obama probably was. So separate power and leadership, that's the essence of the multiplex world. So I think in the world, we might have the United States still most powerful state militarily, maybe a military leader in some cases under a multilateral president. China will be an economic leader, especially when it comes to providing infrastructure aid, like the Belt and Road Initiative. European Union will be a leader, the global leader, when it comes to climate change. So leadership is based on issue areas, not based on power. No single country will be leading in every area. That's a fantasy. It was never really true, maybe only in the first 2 decades of World War II, after World War II, but it was never true. And this will be difficult now, impossible to be like that, to be in that situation. So that's why I also don't want to call it a multipolar world. My term is multiplex, not multipolar. The difference between multipolarity and multiplexity is this, that power is not in the hands of only selected few, that world order is set by more than just great powers. It also includes non-state actors, international institutions, corporations, and people empowered by social media. People play a much bigger role in world order than they ever did because of social media. Connectivity among people, mobilization, mutual influencing is much bigger. They play a role in world order. Regional organizations play a world order. So we have multiple actors than in the traditional multipolarity, which is basically multiple consequential actors now than in multipolarity, where the consequential actors were considered to be great powers and power measured in their economic and military strength. So that's one big difference between multipolarity and multiplexity. And another one I just said is leadership. There will be a separation of power and leadership will be distributed according to issue areas. No single country will be leader in every area, but different countries or different actors will lead in different areas. It will be complex, messy, but that's what the world we're going to get in. That's going to be the reality. So multiplex world is, in that sense, a G plus world. G means government, you know, G7, G20, G77. Well, some people have argued, like Ian Bremmer, that we are in a G0 world. There's no leader. I think that's not true. I think we're in a G plus world. Instead of governments and big powers leading, we have a whole variety of actors leading, providing leadership in every area. So in different, depending on the issue area, in different areas. So no single country or bloc leads in every area, and leadership depends on different issue areas. That's the essence of the world order that we are going to get in. It will not be very clean, it will be messy, but the world will take some time to adjust to it. And you know, in the meantime, we have to overcome the pandemic, and we have to rebuild a global governance structure based on these new realities of multiplexity and G plus leadership. But anybody who is thinking that we can put the Humpty Dumpty back together or bring back the old-fashioned Western world order is probably living in a world of fantasy.